From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Library of Congress. I'm John Van Aldenhoorn, the director of the World Digital Library, which is a project that the Library of Alexandria and Dr. Serageldin are both heavily involved. I'm here to welcome you and to turn the floor over to our leader, Dr. Billington, who will introduce our speaker.
It is a great honor and pleasure to second the welcome and to particularly welcome our distinguished speaker. He is a man of extraordinary accomplishment and versatility and experience. He was a graduate of University of Cairo, doctorate at Harvard. He's had a multiply interesting career as vice president of, I think, in sustainable and environmental policy at the World Bank, also special projects there. He's been involved in agriculture, water development on a global basis, heading up important international groups dealing with both of those. But today, he will talk in the evening. Again, he's about the whole digital revolution, its implications. He was the keynote speaker at the first World Summit of the Book, articulated the values of the book culture very beautifully in December here at the library, and he's played an important role in the World Digital Library and in the conceptualization of what the new digital revolution is doing, can do, and he is helping us in a very central way with this international project, which is also a UNESCO project. Now today he's going to talk about that which he's been doing, so to speak, more recently in the 21st century, along with so many other things, and that is the rebirth of the Library of Alexandria, which is, of course, the great universal library of the classical antiquity, and which he has made it quite dramatically. There's been a book about the events, the relationship, if you like, of the so-called Arab Spring and the special role here, an interesting one of the Library of Alexandria, because it's called Hands Around the Library, Protecting Egypt's Treasured Books. And I'll just show you some of the pictures if you can see them. I'm not giving the lecture, but I think it's worth it. When the protesters were coursing around the streets of Alexandria, they were met by our speaker today, who is depicted here who was explaining to them that the new Library at Alexandria, which is a beautiful building, by the way, in which all kinds of inventive things take place, which he will, I'm sure, tell us about. They were met by the director who did this. Here he is. They were protesting. I think many of them weren't sure what they were protesting, but the head of the Library at Alexandria said, "You have no legitimate protest against what we're doing here, but it's a glass building, it's very vulnerable," and so forth. So what happened? Well, he joined hands with the young people of Alexandria, explained to them that this isn't something they could possibly have as a target for whatever their concerns and questions might be. So here he is again, joining hands. And it was a very remarkable thing because this very large building was surrounded by the joint hands of all these young people who were part of that whole event. And so, and there they are again. It was an amazing phenomenon. Joined hands, hands around the library. So without my attempting to expatiate more, but simply to tell you that we're in the presence of someone who is, if anyone has ever played a role in defending libraries, articulating what they're all about, and is good enough to come to us through the false alarms of snow to be with us for this occasion. Ladies and gentlemen, hoping you'll come back again this evening to hear him talk about the digital revolution, which is playing such a great part cooperatively with us in this World Digital Library. But now to hear the story, the library story, one of the great ones of our time, and one of the great leaders and innovators who brings such richness, 50 books, many honorary degrees, to the business of librarianship. Ladies and gentlemen, its director, its founder, its reviver, Dr. Ismail Serageldin.
Thank you so much, Dr. Billington, and thank you all for being here. It's a great, great honor for me to be back in the greatest library in the world today, the Library of Congress, and my good friend, Jim Billington, and other colleagues whom I see here and with whom I've had the pleasure of working on a number of important projects. I hope we have, yes, I hope everybody can see the slides, because, you know, fasten your seatbelt. I'm going to take you on a wild ride through over 2,300 years of history. And I want to start, first of all, about what the ancient Library of Alexandria was all about. And because really it was not a library, it was much more than that, and how we're evolving and how we try to recapture that for the present. And then I will tell you something about the revolution, and which have been so nicely captured in that book for children by Susan Roth and Karen Leggett-Aburaya, and that Jim was kind enough to show you. So to start our story, the ancient Library of Alexandria. Every time you will see a red slide like that, it's a new chapter, and you'll know I'm getting closer to the end, so don't worry. We'll keep going. My story starts with Alexander the Great, and just to remind you how recent that is for Egypt, 2,300 years ago, the distance in time between Alexander and the builders of the Great Pyramid is greater than the distance in time between Alexander and us. So that's the depth that Egypt represents. Alexander was not just the greatest conqueror, he was also the student of Aristotle. And I've always wondered what it would be like to be personally mentored by Aristotle. Can you imagine? This guy was mentored by Aristotle. Anyway, so he had an interest in a great cultural project, and that was his empire that we all know. And he brought together the various cultures of the world, the Greek and the Egyptian and the Asian together. After his death, his empire was divided, and the part that was Egypt became Ptolemaic Egypt, and Ptolemy, who was a fellow student in the tutoring of Aristotle, took over and implemented the creation of the city of Alexandria, because Alexander just came and selected the site, but actually the city was built later on. And it was in that city that the story begins, and it's all about women. Remarkable women. Let me start out, first of all, that one was Queen Berenike the second wife of Ptolemy I, and she convinced him to put her son as his successor. And her son, Ptolemy II, would rule for 42 years and give an enormous push, made the library his personal project after that. So that was a good thing. Everybody who came to ancient Alexandria considered it a marvel. There were two marvels. One was the pharos, the lighthouse, and the other was the library. Now, what was the library? Well, actually, it was not a library. That's the pharos. The library, we don't know exactly how it looks. This was a reconstruction by Carl Sagan for Cosmos. We know that it had columns, that it had beams, that it had scrolls. There were living quarters. There was a botanical garden, a zoological garden, and a dissection room. And the reason that it was so strange, this is another image of the library reconstructed, that was because a guy called Demetrius of Phaleron convinced Ptolemy that the way, if you really want Alexandria to be great, marbles and temples are fine, but you need to get the greatest minds in the world and then give them nothing to do. And he was not wrong. In fact, that's what the Institute of Advanced Studies at Princeton does. You get the greatest minds in the world and let them do their thing. They either teach or they study or they do what they do. And they produce an explosion of knowledge unlike anything we know. So we don't know what it looked like, but this is a celebratory coin. And take a look at that capital here, because you'll see it in a moment. This is the guy Demetrius of Phaleron, who had ruled Athens as tyrant of Athens. Tyrant was a title. Remember, Archimedes worked for the tyrant of Syracuse. It was a title, didn't have the connotation we had, but he had just been ousted after 10 years, and he was kind of in between jobs. So Ptolemy got him as an advisor, and he's the one who told him to create that. And they called, what are we going to do it? And they said, a temple to the muses. And it was known as the Museon in Latin and Greek, or the museum in Latin. Museum, not in the modern connotation. And it had all those things attached, plus a library. And the library grew and grew and grew, and the name of the library came to encompass everything. So this whole complex, which was part academy, part research institute, part library, and part teaching facility, were in fact under the aegis of Ptolemy II, who, thanks to his mother, succeeded Ptolemy I, gave a big push, and there was also an enormous collection of all the universal knowledge. Now, what sets this library apart? There were libraries in ancient Greece, there were libraries in ancient Egypt, older than that, but they focused on Greek knowledge and on Egyptian knowledge. This was the first library whose ambition was universal knowledge and the ability to integrate all of that universal knowledge in a new way. And they reached an amazing score. They had 700,000 scrolls. We sometimes refer to them as volumes, but they were really more scrolls. And they were teaching at that place, and girl students were very prominent. So not only prominent women in our story, but also prominent girls studying. This is a statue from about 200 BC. So that was the other marvel that people came to visit here. And pretty soon the library grew, so beyond the original museum, they built another library next to the water, and it has a big story with the fire of the library, so that's why I mentioned it. And then later on it continued to grow, and there was a special temple created to a god called Serapis, and the temple was the Serapeum, in which they put the daughter library, further expansions of the library. Now, the Ptolemies were, as I said, a universal culture, so they wrote in Greek and in hieroglyphics, and this is the foundation of the Serapeum inscription, and it's important for us that they use these multiple languages, because otherwise we would not have had the Rosetta Stone, which dates from Ptolemy V, and thanks to which we have been able to rediscover the ancient Egyptian language and a very large part of our ancient history. We wouldn't have known otherwise. Now, Serapis is an interesting character. He was the only god I know of who was created by committee. And they did have a committee of Egyptian priests and Greek priests, and they said very wisely they wanted a deity for Alexandria that would be acceptable to both communities. So they created this guy, part Zeus, part Dionysus. Dionysus, because after all, this is the Mediterranean people, bon vivant. They like certain joie de vivre, so they had Dionysus there. And they had Osiris and Apis. And for 700 years, he would be the god of Alexandria, and his temple would be here, near the area of Arakotis, and the daughter library was added there. As the story goes on, the Ptolemies go on for about 300 years, until the last of the pharaohs and the last of the Ptolemies, Cleopatra. Now, Cleopatra was a very unusual lady, and I'll say more about her because she plays a big role in this part. But let me tell you about what happened in that period. For one thing, a great poet, one of those minds that were brought to the ancient library by the name of Callimachus, the greatest Hellenistic poet of his period, was told by my predecessor, the third director of the library, Eratosthenes, that doing poetry is something you do on your own time. Let's do something useful and write a catalog for the library. And he did in 120 volumes or 120 scrolls called the Pinakes. And that was the first time that universal knowledge was organized by subject and by author within subject, and then alphabetically by author. So Callimachus became either the father of library science, but at very least father of bibliographies, because that's how we still do it today. So it was also a place where Aristarchus was the first human being to say that the earth revolves around the sun and not the other way around, about a full 1800 years before Copernicus. And Eratosthenes was able to calculate the circumference of the earth to within 98.25% accuracy of modern estimates. 98% accuracy. At the time, later on, people still thought about the flat earth. Hipparchus, his colleague, calculated the length of the solar year, 365 days in a quarter, to within 6.5 minutes. Now, when you think of the tools they had, you realize just how awesome these scientific achievements are. And that is why the National Academy of Sciences still considers the ancient Library of Alexandria to be the first precursor knowledge institution. So they established a calendar, and with 365 days in the quarter, and the leap year every fourth year, to which we added a day. And Julius Caesar, when he came, was so enamored with it that he imposed it on the Roman Empire in 44-45 BC, and it became the basis for the Julian calendar. And our most famous employee in the ancient library, Euclid, who wrote the only scientific text that is still taught unchanged for 2,200 years, and the elements of geometry. Even the more recent events are defined as non-Euclidean geometry, the geometry of Riemann and others. Archimedes came as a visiting scholar. He stayed for 2.5 years, went back, should have stayed. He wouldn't have been murdered by the Roman soldier back in Syracuse. But what he did while he was there, he was studying levers and hydrostatics. But en passant, he gave the Egyptians the Archimedean screw to help them raise the water of the Nile for irrigation. And as you can see, 2,200 years later, it is still in use. Exactly the way Archimedes did it 2,200 years ago, because it's very efficient. Herophilus identified different parts of the body and gave us functional anatomy. Manetho organized the history of the pharaohs. When we talk about pharaohs being in the 18th dynasty or the 23rd dynasty, these are the classifications that Manetho wrote in the ancient Library of Alexandria. And the first ever translation of the Old Testament from Hebrew into Greek, the Septuagint, was done in the ancient Library of Alexandria. So it was really a beacon of global knowledge. And then St. Mark brought Christianity to Alexandria and from Alexandria to all of Africa. And the early church fathers had a good relationship with the library and with the philosophers, and Clement of Alexandria and Origen and others were trying to bring together that great marriage of philosophy and theology that would engage great thinkers throughout time. But there's a sad story attached to the enormous persecution of the Christians by the Romans in a moment. And the girls continued to be taught at the ancient library, including one who will become very famous in a while. Now, of all of that greatness, little remains physically, but it still inspires people. When was it destroyed? Well, the story about its being destroyed by the invading Arabs is not true. It was destroyed centuries before. And in fact, this was destroyed in stages. Now, you remember we had 3 stages here. And let me go back to Cleopatra, because I really have to defend Cleopatra everywhere I go, and I'll tell you why in a minute. Julius Caesar arrives in Egypt, pursuing Pompey in 48 BC. And Cleopatra had just been ousted by her brother. And so, and that part of it is true, she has herself rolled in a carpet and brought into Caesar's camp. And they unroll the carpet, which they think is a gift for Caesar, and there's the young Cleopatra. Now, she was not very beautiful, contrary to Hollywood versions and contrary to Shakespeare, but she was very charismatic, very educated. She spoke 5 languages, she did poetry, she wrote poetry, and she did mathematics, which for a young princess in her age is enormous education. She had a lot of charisma and personality. And you have to remember that both Caesar and Antony were masters of the world. So if it was just physical, they had the choice of the best, most beautiful slave girls anywhere in the world at that time. Now, there was something about her personality that attracted them. And Caesar decided to stay with her against her brother. And in the war that became the Alexandrian War, he burnt both fleets. And in that, inadvertently, the building next to the water burned down. And that was the first great fire. Depending on who you read, 40,000, 100,000, 400,000 scrolls were destroyed. We don't know. But what we do know is important, because right after the death of Caesar, in comes Mark Antony. Friends, Romans, and countrymen, lend me your ears, etc., etc. And he falls head over heels in love with Cleopatra. Now, what is the way to her heart? That is very so. What gift does Mark Antony think of giving her? Now, mind you, this is Antony Hollywood version, Antony real. This is Cleopatra Hollywood version, and this is Cleopatra real. But what was the way to her heart? And the way to her heart was to give her the 200,000 scrolls of Pergamon's library to the Library of Alexandria. So I ask you, what kind of a woman is it whose way to her heart is a massive book donation to the National Library? My kind of woman. That's why I feel I always have to defend Cleopatra at all times. She deserves it. She deserves it. So anyway, the scrolls arrived, and it's true that they had a fabulous love affair, and that has been written about poetically from Shakespeare to Ahmad Shawqi in Egypt. Together, of course, they confronted Octavian, the Battle of Actium, decisive naval battle where they lost, ended up with the suicide of both Antony and Cleopatra, and Octavian then becomes the undisputed ruler of the world, the first Roman emperor under the name of Augustus, and Egypt becomes a Roman province. That's 30 BC. And now the emergence of Christianity resulted in enormous persecution of the Christians in Egypt by the Romans, to the point where the calendar of the Egyptian Copts today does not start in synchronicity with the Common Era. It starts from 293 AD, which is called the Year of the Martyrs. There were so many persecutions going on. And there was riots and civil strife and so on, and things were really bad until another great woman comes along. This time, it's Queen Zenobia of Palmyra in Syria. And she conquers Alexandria, where she is welcomed as a savior. And she rules Alexandria. That's Palmyra, the remnants of Palmyra in Syria. It's called Tadmor in Arabic. And she rules it for a year and a half or two before Aurelian comes back, Emperor Aurelian, to put order. And I don't tell you what Roman emperors did to put order in rebellious provinces. Actually, they destroyed everything in the royal district, and according to the scholars, he left no stone on top of the other in the entire royal district, including the original museum of the Library of Alexandria, the original building of the Library of Alexandria. And also, for those of you who have Indiana Jones inclinations, when you come to visit Alexandria, as a result of that, 272 AD destruction, now the first part was destroyed earlier on, the second part, 272 AD, and this entire area was destroyed. He left us the biggest question in archaeology. Where is the tomb of Alexander the Great? We know it was there somewhere. We know that Caesar went to visit it, Octavian went to visit it when he was in Egypt. It's somewhere. You talk to people, say, oh, it's underneath this building. If you destroy this building, you'll find it there. But somebody else, no, it's that building here. If you destroy it, you'll find it there. But who knows, if you go into the catacombs, which you can visit in Alexandria, maybe you'll press a wall like Indiana Jones and discover the tomb of Alexander. It's also, the ancient library was completely destroyed. The palaces of the Ptolemies were destroyed. All of that was destroyed. And the only thing that remained was the daughter library in the temple to Serapis. Now, contrary to general impressions, Constantine the Great, when he embraced Christianity, did not ban other religions. 70 years later, Emperor Theodosius issues an edict in 391 AD that forbids all religions other than Christianity in the Roman Empire. And then Patriarch Theophilus in Alexandria goes and burns the pagan temple to Serapis in 391 AD. So old Serapis had a run of almost 700 years as the cult god, not bad for a committee creation. And this is a manuscript that shows Theophilus standing on the burning of the Serapeum. It's in Vienna right now. And what survived then was just the personal collections of a few scholars who are the remnants of the ancient library, what was left of it, in their possession, and another great woman. See, I keep telling you, the story is all filled with great women. And that is Hypatia. She is the first woman whose name appears in the scrolls of mathematics and astronomy. She was a Neoplatonist philosopher, very beautiful, great speaker, and a very prominent person. She was, however, murdered by the mob in 415 AD. And it was cut to pieces, and the flesh scraped from the bone, and they lit fire to the remains. It was a horrible, horrible incident. And beyond that, then everybody disappears. All the scholars disappear. She was the daughter of Theon, the last recorded scholar and director of the library, who was also one of the great commentators on Euclid. The story of Hypatia is the first martyr to science, because after all, Socrates was really killed for his political views rather than his science views. But she was the end of that great intellectual adventure of the ancient library. The schools that remained after that were totally under the thumb of the church, and it was the beginning of the Dark Ages. I mean, we're talking 5th century. From the 5th to the 15th century are generally referred to as the Dark Ages in Europe as well as starting here. Films have been made about it. Agora is a film. There, a little bit of poetic license. They collapsed the destruction of the Serapeum with the murder of Hypatia, but they are 25 years apart in history. But nevertheless, poetic license allows that film to take place. There is Hypatia and Theon in Agora. The real Hypatia, that's the death mask. And that is the end, except that the scientists of the world, leading from the United States, recognized her by naming a crater on the moon after her. And I think that's a nice recognition of her role in science. So if you look at this, you will see that the ancient library did not have a single fire, but actually at least 3 major destructive events with a gradual decline over almost 450 years of gradual decline. And the old library gives us nothing except for one thing, which I'm sure Jim Billington and and President Joya will sympathize with, I have the oldest record of complaints against funding research. From Timon of Phlius in the 2nd century BC, is talking about the spending on the library and the scholarship, and says that surely the kings of Egypt have more useful ways of spending their money than to bring a bunch of bookworms and scribblers to gab and talk in the courtyard of the Muses, which was the temple of the Muses where they used to meet. I've gone to my Minister of Finance and said to him, history has shown that of all the investments made, that was the one that has continued to be the biggest return on investment. It didn't impress him. But history is another. So what's left of that? Fragments of the past. That is the Serapeum, which you can visit, and the catacombs there, where you can go and discover other things, the Roman theaters. This fort, which is built with the rubble of the ancient lighthouse. And under the water, the remnants of ancient Alexandria, including that capital. Now, doesn't that look like the one on the coin I showed you at the beginning? Maybe it's the very same one. Who knows? But what I do know is this. We did fish out Ptolemy I, and I said to the Antiquities Department, bring him home. Bring him home. And here he is standing at the gate of the new Library of Alexandria, where he deserves to be, founder of the ancient library and now guardian of the new library. Now, when we came about, and I quit all my jobs here to go back to do this, to revive the ancient Library of Alexandria. What a beautiful project in the 21st century. And to do that, we have to capture the spirit of the ancient library. And this description is important because the library was not just a library. It was a lot of other things, research, academy, teaching, a lot of things together. Art, after all, Callimachus was a poet, even though he produced the catalog for the library, but he was a poet. So the library has evolved. Great libraries as repositories of books with vast reading rooms were rapidly changing. Knowledge was parsed in individual volumes. I have a lot more to say about this tonight. The books themselves, as a book lover, what can I tell you, are extremely valuable as objects as well as content. And the modern version of the library largely followed that same classical mode for a while until we started seeing that carols for computers began emerging. Old card catalogs gave way to modern searching tools, and pictures were being classified in ways that we couldn't think of before. Students working today were very different from students working in the past. Although many of us still hope that books are here to stay, I think they will be there to stay in their content, but not necessarily in their format, because that's the way things are now. People who look at youngsters and say, how can they possibly read that way? I imagine people holding scrolls, looking at the first codex and saying, how can he possibly read that way? After all these great classics, Homer, Euripides, etc., Euclid, were written on scrolls and read on scrolls for centuries. It was only in the 4th to the 5th century AD that gradually the codex, a group of leaves bound on one side we call the spine with a slightly heavier cover, became the dominant form because it was so convenient. And so today there are new forms that will be more convenient. And so we already see this, which breaks my heart, I must tell you. I'm an incurable romantic when it comes to love of books. This is the first bookless library, Engineering School of the University of Texas, San Antonio, in October 2010, announced the abolition of all books from their shelves and everything digital, 18,000 journals and 425,000 books. And there are more profound issues ahead. I'm not going to get into these because I'll discuss them later, but that's for another discussion. But it's that spirit that was in our mind when I said we have to recreate the ancient library. And so the new Library of Alexandria is more than a library in the conventional sense, and it has a lot of things, starting with a very beautiful building, a hive of activities, multiple institutions, libraries, museums, galleries, etc. I'll tell you about them in a moment. But when people said to me, Egypt at the time was the richest country in the world, today Egypt is a very poor country, how can you possibly aspire to recreate the ancient library? I said, wait and see. And here we are. So first of all, we were lucky to start with a very beautiful building. And that is the building. It was an award-winning building. This is the campus of the university. And the sea is over here. And this is a planetarium. That was an existing conference center. And all of that is connected underground with multiple floors. So it's a huge complex. The building is very beautiful, as you can see. And on the wall of granite, it has letters from all the alphabets of the world without a complete word. It just opens to all alphabet. And the plaza that connects these buildings is wide open, and there's no walls, no gates, no nothing. This is where you go down to the planetarium, and that is, I actually later on I'll tell you, I had to escape from one of those windows. That's another story I'll tell you about it. And this is a very beautiful building. So if you were to lift that cover of the building, you would see that it is divided like that. On this side, we have administration and research centers, and on this side, the formal library. And that's our reading room. A very beautiful space. And the architecture is really spectacular. The conference center, our auditorium, 1,700 seats. And on the plaza, very appropriate, I think, we have this statue that you see here of Prometheus bringing fire to humanity, donated by this Greek sculptor. Everything in the library is donated because we have no money, so I have to convince people. As people said, well, what do you have? I said, charm, conviction. I'm basically, I think all people involved in cultural institutions spend a very large part of their time raising money. So you have to do, that's all you have. So what do we have? We created a huge hive of activities. I created the staff that we had about 50 staff when I started. We have 2,400 right now working in the library in less than 10 years. And we have all of these complexes. We receive a huge number of visitors. Just before the revolution, we had reached 1.4 million visitors. In the first year of the revolution, it dropped to around 800,000. This year, I expect to be back up to 1 million, but we'll be getting back there again. I reach out to children. I've been reaching out to children for 10 years. So children who were 6 or 7 then are now 16 and 17, and they've been used to the library. We have special programs for them, and we receive over 3.3 million hits a day. So it's about 1.2 billion hits on our website. And 600,000 reader visits a year. And we hold 700 cultural events in terms of conferences and exhibitions and the like. And we organize art school. Remember, little girls being educated in the ancient library? Well, we're educating them in art as well as in sciences right now. We organized our own classical orchestra. We hold concerts. Also concerts outside, and ballet, and singing, and many of these events keep going in the library. We hold international gatherings, an annual book fair. So all these activities are part of what the library's outreach programs are like. And the institutions themselves, we provide the secretariat for a lot of these institutions, and we have a strong commitment to the arts. This is from the late Salah Abdel Karim, a great Egyptian artist, and to the sciences. Now, our libraries per se, we start with a hybrid library. Our library, from the beginning, we didn't have enough resources to create a proper foundation in books, but everywhere we have computers. And these are the old computers, now they're all flat screens. And we have specialized libraries. So the Tahsin Library for the visually impaired, Children's Library 5 to 11, Young People's Library, 11 to 16, multimedia, audiovisual libraries, rare books, microforms, map library, and the Internet Archive. We're the only place outside of San Francisco that has a copy of the Internet Archive. That's Brewster Kahle who created it, and we go from 1996 to 2007. After that, it became too big, so we specialized in the Arabic part. And we're continuing our work on that. Now, this Internet Archive is the equivalent of the ancient library trying to get all the written product of humanity, because soon enough, everything will be digital. Then we were able to convince the French to give us a huge donation. And actually, they did. They gave us 500,000 books, biggest donation in history. And that made us the fourth largest Francophone library. I had only 40,000 books, so we got 540 outside of France. And I was telling the Frenchman in question that, this is the biggest book donation since Antony gave Cleopatra the 200,000 scrolls. And he said to me, yeah, well, I hope I don't end up like Antony. And I said, wait a minute, what's wrong with Antony? I mean, after all, the guy ruled half the world. He had a magnificent love story with Cleopatra that people are still talking about today. And 2,000 years later, when Hollywood wanted to represent him, they got the young Marlon Brando and Richard Burton to do the role. Who's going to be representing you 2,000 years from now? And he said, when you put it that way, except for that last part, being Antony wasn't so bad. And I said, yeah, well, it's got its compensation. So this shows us where we rank now among Francophone libraries because of that gift. Plus, we have ongoing streams of gifts from many others. One came from a group of American friends, 22,000 volumes. Dr. Boutros Ghali, the former Secretary General of the UN, gave us a complete copy that he owned of the Description de l'Égypte, and so on. Now, museums and galleries, we have 19 museums and permanent art galleries. These are the 4 museums. One is dedicated to President Sadat, who was a great hero of peace, a martyr of peace, as you know. One is a manuscript museum. We have 6,600 manuscripts that were donated to us from the Municipal Library of Alexandria, and there it is. And we have an antiquities museum, which is a nice museum with donations from all the museums of Egypt. So the Coptic Museum, the Pharaonic Museum, the Greco-Roman Museum, and the Islamic Museum are all making donations to our museum. And these are parts of it. And we have a science museum, which was done with the French CNAM as well. This is the part, history of science, but you also have, it's linked with the planetarium and with an exploratorium, so where the children can actually play around and do hands-on science. So they can see movies in the planetarium, they visit the History of Science Museum to know what their forefathers in ancient Egypt, ancient Library of Alexandria, and medieval period presented, and then they go and have hands-on experience. And we encourage them to challenge and think, what if, what if, what if? And this is a special outreach to youth. This is a program during an eclipse, and we have our science festival annually, and we had 20,000 people, as you can see, for the science festival, where the kids were presenting their ideas and their experiments. And this, to me, is one of the great pictures, because the kids are having fun. And science is all about convincing kids that it's the joy of discovery. That's the journey of being in science. It's not about learning, Boyle's law and Avogadro's number and all of that. We have 15 permanent exhibitions and art galleries, including Sharia Abdel Salam, including these. These are all donated by the artists in question, some of whom passed away, some of whom are still alive today. And everywhere you go, you have this mixture of books, digital, art, all together. This is a folkloric art collection, and we have 10 more of these. 4 galleries for temporary exhibitions that rotate and change in time. And we have 10 research institutes. One deals with manuscripts, fairly obvious, but where we digitize the manuscripts and make them available. Scholars can take a digital copy of every page of the manuscript with good picture quality and study it there, as well as we hold conferences and the like. We have a special center for the study of history of writing and calligraphy. We have special studies that is a virtual center that links Egyptian scientists with other scientists working around the world. And it holds the biannual BioVision conference, which is held every alternating year in Lyon and in Alexandria. And the proceedings of these conferences, which include Nobel laureates and so on, are very distinguished. We have a center for the documentation of heritage, which is located in Cairo, and it has created the first ever Culturama, which we patented. And we patented it simply to show that we were the first in doing it, not for commercial reasons. And soon we'll be making it in 3D. We have a center of informatics, which has been collaborating with the Library of Congress, and we'll say more about that in a moment, where a lot of very high-level informatics is being done. We did the digital curated Description de l'Égypte and other works as well. We have an art center that created the first classical orchestra in Alexandria. There wasn't one. And where we invite all these activities I mentioned before. A center dedicated to the study of Alexandria and the Mediterranean, not just the ancient, but the modern city as well. And a center for Hellenistic studies, because that is the period of the ancient library, and we are co-jointly with the University of Alexandria offering master's and PhD programs in that. It's the only degree granting program we have. We have a center for the study of democracy and social peace, which came from the previous dialogue forum, where we talked about the need for reform, what later on became the Arab Spring. We have a center for development studies as well. So all the centers hold events, produce publications, and the like. And all of that together, I think, is part of this complex of trying to recapture the spirit of the ancient library in the new. But it is an institution that was born digital. And thus, it's somewhat different. We are committed to access to all information for all people at all times. We link up and cooperate with others and add to the available digital material. But today, we really can put at the fingertips of people all the information in the world, in global knowledge. We ourselves, in adding to our content, have digitized over 200,000 books, and we try to honor the past, celebrate the present, and embrace the future. So how do we honor the past? Well, there's obviously the first one is manuscripts. And on that, as I mentioned, we do this kind of work, and we provide it for free to visitors. CultNat, that center, has created an archaeological map of Egypt where you can go and you can click on a site and then choose a part of a site, and then you get this tomb, and you can navigate inside the tomb and go to a wall, and you get a text, and the text is translated into English. And then we did the same for the architectural heritage of cities, by the important listed monuments, by building, by street, by architect, the wildlife preserves, and the intangible heritage, music, and photographic memory. Old photographs are being kept, and the documentation of folklore before it disappears in that screen. And all of that you can visit on eternalegypt.org. And we continue. AlexMed as well does these recreations of the ancient past, and works with other centers this is the mapping of what's underwater, the pieces that are underwater, which I showed you earlier on. These are some of them. And this is, of course, the fort that was created with the rubble of the ancient pharaohs. And the history of modern Egypt has been created, and in that sense, it's kind of a mini World Digital Library, one language, not 7 languages going on 14, right, John? And we have Description de l'Égypte, which we digitized and so on, and we created the archives. We created archives of President Nasser, of President Sadat, and of Boutros Ghali, and of other eminent people. And we took institutional coverage as well. So the Suez Canal documents, we have 2.5 million documents of these. This is the history of Al-Hilal and so on. And we celebrate the presence partly by our digital book collection and by digitizing maps, pictures, videos, and all of that. And we provide a special course called the Science Super Course, 170,000 PowerPoint lectures for free. And people can either take a whole lecture and use it to teach, or can take individual slides and compose their own lectures, whatever they want. And it's been successful in reaching a lot of people. All important lectures in the BA are webcast. And we embrace the future both by asking in the past period for reform and in the current period for defending certain basic values, and by embracing the cause of children. So the reform program is we believed in a vibrant civil society during the authoritarian period. We drafted this Declaration of Alexandria in March 2004, which talked about political, social, economic, and cultural reforms. And we defended these values, especially of freedom of expression. And I was very proud of the fact that our colleagues in Norway, from the National Library of Norway, created that program, Beacon for Freedom, dedicated to the new Library of Alexandria, because they valued what we do. And we created ICT formats for the NGOs to link up on. And we worked with children on providing science, on open source systems, and the science outreach with mass media. We created our own TV studio, our own FM station. This is our TV van. And enormous analytical work which is presented and done there. We don't do biorobotics, but they get regularly presented at the Library of Alexandria. And this little guy is really cute. His name is Nao, and he's very popular. When he goes on stage, everybody applauds. We have virtual reality chamber. We have our own supercomputer. And so in many ways, the digital future is there, and we do have the technology to do this. But we have outreach to the universities, to children. This little bookmobile goes to all the schools around to tell them. We have art programs I mentioned to you, and the massive expansion of our science clubs and science fairs and science competitions, and even a science TV series, which we did in our own studios. But I think the most important thing before the revolution, which resulted in what Jim Billington mentioned about hands around the library, was defending values. Starting with that March 2004, we opened in October 2002, so it's barely within 18 months of the inauguration, we issued this huge declaration, and we organized forums every year after that to discuss these values, including youth forums from all over the Arab world. 600 in 2010 came from all the Arab world, participatory structures. So we have an institution that reaches out, that brings in, that functions almost like breathing in and out, and that has all these pieces, and all the parts are essential, and they reinforce each other, and the whole is more than the sum of the parts, which allows me, and this picture was taken by an Australian friend who did this, to cite the person I admire so much, Borges, who said that I imagine paradise to be some kind of library. I agree with that. Then came the revolution in Egypt. There are moments like that. In Europe in 1848, suddenly revolutions broke out all over Europe. Again in 1968, whether you were in the United States, in Paris, or in London, or in Cairo, there were student revolts everywhere. And in 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and there was Eastern Europe, and 91 in Russia as well. And now in 2011, it's the Arab Spring, and all of these are explosions across the Arab world, which you can see. It seemed as an unstoppable tide had been released. And sure enough, people in peaceful demonstrations, whether in Tunisia or Egypt, also brought down many tyrants or many authoritarian figures. This is Tahrir Square in Egypt normally. This is Tahrir Square during the revolution, and during the daytime and at night, and during prayer time, and against the hated central police of the time. And this is was a symbolic counter-revolutionary effort called the Battle of the Camel, where camels and people with sticks and swords came to attack the demonstrators, who were mostly kids with iPads and iPhones and Facebook. And this cartoon summarizes it. As you can see, there's the police, and it says Facebook and Twitter are the weapons being carried by the youngsters. And there was a rejection of the president and his son, and it was followed by the rest of the world. And I'm quite intrigued by Wisconsin, actually. Look at these pictures from Wisconsin. So Egypt took 18 days. What happens in Wisconsin? Fight like an Egyptian. I like this one best. Egypt, help us. Egypt supports Wisconsin. So anyway, but what happened to the BA during the revolution? And that's what Jim mentioned. Now remember, I mentioned to you this picture. This is the campus, And these two streets here, the red streets, is where massive demonstrations came. Demonstrations were not only in Cairo, they were all over Egypt. But look, they held hands. They are holding up a sign against the president, even though the library is directly attached to the president, but they're protecting the library. And everybody obeyed. See, and it's peaceful. They're just holding rolls of paper here. And there's the demonstration going by. And when prayer time came, people are very orderly. See, this is the library. And nobody crossed the line of people holding hands. And it wasn't just that. 10 blocks away, they totally destroyed Government House, as you can see. There's nothing left of it now. They destroyed the party headquarters, they destroyed Government House, they destroyed the police headquarters. So it wasn't the foregone conclusion that, in fact, there are only two buildings that were so protected by the revolutionaries: the Egyptian Museum in Tahrir Square and the Library of Alexandria in Alexandria. And then they created this huge flag and wrapped the flag around the library. And here it is. You can see they put the flag here. And there were the children there, and there's me with the revolutionaries and waving to passing demonstrations at that time. And this is on the side of the university campus, the other street. And if you look here, you will see that they are holding hands as well here. See this human chain? There's nothing that prevents this demonstration from spilling over into the library. And they are big demonstrations. Then these steps became like the favorite meeting place for human rights demonstrations. And when we started having, post the early phase of revolution, problems with the religious problems between Muslims and Christians would come there, and those who demanded equality before the law and so on were all there. And 8 years of hard work resulted in that very powerful contrast. Plus, the kids, I mean, I don't know who these people are, these kids who are here, but I also don't know who painted this magnificent mural. And it says, the youth of the 25th of January, the revolution. It says here, dedicated to those who died in the revolution. And it shows the three pyramids, and the fourth pyramid is the library. And out of it comes a church and a mosque together. Said, the kids got the message right. They got it right. And that is the book that Jim was just showing you. And I'm glad to see that Tharwat is here. I'll pass on our appreciation to Susan and to Karen Leggett who did that. But later on, the revolution went into some other problems that you know about. A wave of unrest. No institution was immune. The Academy of Sciences was burned to the ground in 17th of December, 2011. I'm the vice president of the Academy. It was rebuilt later on, but at the time it was burnt. We then moved on, and despite the wonderful start, the BA itself was not immune to the troubles in the country. And I got into a number of problems with the students, and not with the students, with some of the staff and some of their supporters outside. And what we did then was this is at the moment when the troubles were most acute. And later on they came and at my office, and I avoided conflicts. I did not want to call in police or anybody, because I abhor violence, but I also believe in rationality and ideas. And thus, even though, as I said, I left through the window at one occasion to avoid these problems, rationality brought things back to normal very quickly, and the library functioned again. It's only for a few days, on a few weeks, that we had this little blip, and we're still one of the few institutions in Egypt that is functioning normally today. So everything returned to normal, and Prometheus still stands proudly in front of the library. So what happens to the future? Well, after an 18-month transition ruled by the military, we have our first elected civilian president, and also the most educated president we have had, since he has a PhD and was teaching from the United States. But turbulence continued, and the stakes are high. And why are the stakes so high? Well, for various historical reasons, I think you will agree with me that it's important that develop a different understanding between the West and the Muslim world generally, and with the United States specifically. Now, the Arab world has a disproportionate influence within the Muslim world. For 340 million Arabs have a huge impact on the 1.4 billion Muslims around the world. And Egypt has a disproportionate impact and within the Arab world. So a successful democratic transition into a liberal, pluralistic Egypt would have an enormous impact, not just on the Arab world, but from the Arab world onto the whole Muslim world. So the success of Egypt's democratic transition is very, very important. Where are we going? Well, I have 5 reasons for being an optimist. I'm always an optimist, but I have 5 reasons to be optimistic about what's going on in Egypt, despite everything you hear today. And the first of these is nonviolence. Given the size of the demonstrations and the conflicts we are having in Egypt, actually, it's extremely nonviolent. These are the supporters of the president's last set of actions. These are the opponents. And these are demonstration of opponents going towards Tahrir Square. You see the whole bridge is covered there. So the size of all these people, the number of casualties is very, very limited. Secondly, there's an enormous adherence to the rule of law. It reminds me a bit of the United States when people say, you know, oh, goddamn Supreme Court should be impeached and so on. But what the Supreme Court said stands. And Egypt's Supreme Constitutional Court forced the president to abolish the past parliament, and he obeyed. The third reason, and the other thing about the rule of law is I want to say, I mean, can you imagine, I mean, in Egypt, people fight by filing briefs in the Supreme Constitutional Court, in the Supreme Administrative Court. I mean, can you imagine in Syria, somebody trying to file a brief against Bashar al-Assad or something? It's just not even conceivable, right? The election, we have had 7 elections, which were just beautiful, and it shows that Egyptians can settle their differences with ballots and not with bullets. Women participate, and what's interesting in this picture is you see the enormous difference in age, in outlook, in political perspective. And everybody is proud to have voted. We do these finger things, the ink, so that you can't come back again. And a very orderly process. You can see queues, very organized, self-organizing, there's no problem. And the ballots have not been contested. I mean, I think everything is very good. The fourth reason I'm optimistic is, contrary to most people, I think the fact that the country is deeply divided is very good. Because I think the real fear for me would have been if either Mr. Morsi or Mr. Shafiq, who was his opponent, they got about 50% of the vote, had gotten 75% of the vote. Because then the tendency to crush the remaining 25% and impose your view would have been unstoppable. But it was a very narrow victory. It was 51, 48 something. And so what's wrong with a deeply divided country? You've had them before, and you've reunited since, and you've had them again. And who remembers the hanging Chads, right? So a deeply divided country can be rallied together. The problem is that each side right now dreams of completely knocking out the other, but it's not going to happen because they are more or less balanced. And then as a result, exhausted by their efforts, they're going to have to learn to compromise. And that is the beginning of pluralistic democratic politics. So this deep divide, incidentally, preceded the revolution. I want to be clear about this because people say, look what the revolution created. I say, no. We've had this divide before. And there has been, Muslim societies are just fundamentally split. Look at this, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Different perspectives of society, right? Look at these 2 couples. Couple number 1, couple number 2. These are old pictures. This is in the harbor of Alexandria before the revolution. These differences on perspective of what our society should look like are profound and have existed before the revolution. The revolution is simply allowing them to find political expression. And that is because before they were suppressed. They would occasionally break out. This was a demonstration pro-wearing the veil against the former Minister of Culture of Egypt, who had made derogatory comments about the veil. And these demonstrations were against him. There were efforts to ban books for a long time in our societies. It's not new. And censorship contravenes human rights, but it's there. And that's why we must fight for freedom of expression. And the battles must be fought again and again. In 1926, one of our most eminent intellectuals, Taha Hussein, was accused of apostasy and blasphemy in 1926. And again, 70 years later, Nasr Hamid Abu Zaid was. The difference was that the case was dismissed in 1926, and he was found guilty in 1996, not by the government, but by Islamists who so harassed him and his wife that he moved to the Netherlands. Now, I invited Nasr to give a series of lectures at the library, and he came. He passed away 2 years ago. But that was not the answer. The point is that these differences existed. And my young friends who come, they have a simpler way of presenting it. They say, censorship sucks. Doctor, stop giving us all that stuff about why we know it's just terrible. So we must deal with these divides, and accepting pluralism is part of accepting these divides. The last thing is an amazing miracle of Egyptian revolution has been the public participation. In fact, the whole revolution was about public participation. But if you asked me before that, 2 years ago, I would have told you apathy. Apathy, the Egyptians are too apathetic. If you told them, somebody's going to change the constitution, well, Mubarak changes the constitution, who cares? But now everything's changed. Bloggers and their readers are everywhere. And these are more upscale bloggers. These are downscale bloggers, but they're still bloggers. And I thought this one was really cute. Stuff or I'll tweet, right? Well, there are supporters for the president, and this is the political landscape post-revolution, all these political parties. Now, of course, these are just paper parties with small people, because we know that after the first election, this is what it really looks like. So between religious and secular, between left and right, this is the Muslim Brotherhood, and this was the Salafi party, which is now split in three. But it shows you, these are the blocks that exist pretty much. There was a rush to complete the draft constitution. The presidential statements today are subjected to intense scrutiny and debate. The leaders of the opposition Salvation Front are very prominent people. And these are people with the president. These are people against the president. You can hardly tell them apart, right? If you didn't read the text, you would know which is. These are against the president. The women's groups are protesting about certain articles in the Constitution, and they are participating, and that's wonderful. And this was a creative YouTube protest that was anti-Constitution. It says, even the fish vote against the Constitution. But the ballot box prevails, and that's essential. The Constitution is in place. Everything has been amended, even though we disagree with it. But like the American Constitution, when Madison promised that there would be a Bill of Rights, let's just agree on that Constitution. They say, okay, let's agree on the Constitution. We're going to amend it now. So they're trying to amend it. So we're preparing for the next elections now. And that's the basis for optimism in our second republic, 3 to 5 years from now. From 0 to 3 years, we have a little bit of turbulence ahead. What is this short-term turbulence? Well, if you were to look stability and institutions, things are improving. Then we go through a period like that, and then it stabilizes. And now we are here. We are in this turbulent part. But it's no reason to lose sight of where we're going. We will have a bumpy road. Why? Well, partly because these confrontations between the two sides, until they reach compromise and understand that they have to coexist and therefore compromise, is part of the bumpiness. The economic crisis we're going through is going to create a lot of bumpiness. And it takes time to develop a culture of pluralism, a culture that recognizes differences of views. And I believe in the power of ideas. And I bring my expert witness. The guy should know, right? That's actually what he said, Napoleon Bonaparte. Do you know what astonished me most in the world? The inability of force to create anything. In the long run, the sword is always beaten by the mind. Now, this guy, of course, created the civil code in France, as well as used the sword a lot. And that's his conclusion. So in our case, we must emphasize human rights, freedom of expression, demand the amendments where they need to be done, and we dare to dream and we dare to invent the future in building the new Egypt. And I'm working with powerful forces in society, like the current Sheikh al-Azhar, who really is promoting a tolerant view of liberal Islam. That's, you see me with him here in giving talks in Al-Azhar, produced the Al-Azhar Declaration. We are reissuing the classics of Islamic humanism for the last 200 years. And to all who agree or differ with me, I say, like Albert Camus, don't walk behind me, I may not lead. Don't walk in front of me, I may not follow. Just walk beside me and be my friend. That's what we need. That's what pluralism is all about. Now, there's so much more to do. And as I said, we have a difficult moment, but it's a moment where we should also dare to dream. And I believe that our library is proud to join these artisans of a better future. And as Henley said, it matters not how straight the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. And I thank you.
As you mentioned, the Arabs did not burn down the library, but there's an apocryphal story that the Arab leaders said that if all this knowledge in the library, if it's not in the Quran, we don't need it. I mean, if it's not in the Quran,
Yes.
we don't need it, and if it's in the Quran,
Yeah,
we already have it. But you're saying that are the Islamic fundamentalists today, the extreme right, are they still as opposed to knowledge per se? Or what kinds of knowledge are they?
Well, I think that, first of all, the apocryphal story that if all the books support what is in the Quran, we don't need them, and if they disagree, then we don't want them, is an apocryphal story. And there's a beautiful essay by Bernard Lewis, in which he says, he proves that this whole story is nonsensical, because it appears only in the 12th century. So we have 500 years of people writing chronicles of the invasion of Egypt, none of which mention that story for 500 years. And then all of a sudden, in the 12th century, it appears in a chronicle. And the reason it does, most of us believe, is because Saladin, the great Saladin at the time, sold things including the libraries of the Fatimids. He was funding his war effort in Palestine against the Crusaders at the time, and he did that. And that was a story that sort of gave it credence by saying, well, even the great Omar at the time decided it was all right to destroy the ancient library, so why shouldn't the Sultan sell the library? That was why it appeared around that time, most of us think. But the story is apocryphal. I simply tell you the ultimate proof is very simple. What did the Arabs do when they confronted the newly discovered philosophy of the Greeks? They didn't burn their books, they didn't declare them as atheists, they translated them, they wrote the exegesis about them, they called Plato and Aristotle al-Hakimain, the two wise men, and they took what was convenient for them, they left what wasn't, and later on, in fact, the recreation of the ancient library, because nobody asked me that question, but I should tell you that. If we lost the ancient library, how come we have all these works? Or at least a large part of them. We do because of Al-Ma'mun, who was the son of Harun al-Rashid. Now you have to remember Baghdad of the Arabian Nights. The Abbasid Empire spreads from Morocco to India, from Central Asia to Sudan, and in Baghdad, he creates the House of Wisdom. And he says that anybody who brings an old manuscript and translates it into Arabic will receive its weight in gold. And that very quickly does two things. One, within 70 years, Arabic becomes the language of knowledge, much as English is today, and it stays that way for several centuries. And many people rediscover the ancient works through the Arabic translations and copies made of them. But the second thing it does, of course, is that like a huge vacuum cleaner, it picks up all the remnants of the ancient library of copies and so on that were in that vast empire. If you're in Tunisia or in Egypt and you had a manuscript, you take it to Baghdad, have it translated into Arabic, and get its weight in gold. And another parenthesis to say to the ministers of finance, his minister of finance told him, the scholars are cheating, sire. They write in big letters on thick paper. But Al-Ma'mun says, let them be, for the gold we give them is as nothing compared to what they give us. Unfortunately, it's not the attitude of the Office of Management and Budget, and it's not the attitude of my own Minister of Finance. So people who behaved that way, who held up the torch of tolerance and knowledge, who tolerated, I mean, the great Jewish scholar Maimonides was part of the court. Ibn Ishaq, the great Christian scholars who helped in the translations in Baghdad. They were open to the knowledge that came from India. They took the numerals from India, the 0, and then gave them to the West. So there was an enormous openness. That behavior is totally incompatible with that apocryphal story, which, as I said, appears only 500 years later. So.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for a great lecture. Just a conference on women's position, and a delegate from Egypt, a female activist, she argued that the position of women has vastly deteriorated after the Arab Spring. Would you agree with the assessment?
Well, not so much after the Arab Spring, after the latest series of actions, including the current draft of the Constitution. And that's why I showed you pictures of all the women demonstrating. When I showed you at the end part, I showed you for and against, and I said that people want to amend the Constitution because there are articles there that many of us think are wrong. And but anyway, it was rushed. And as I said, there's a committee right now with a very prominent scholar who's a member of our board of trustees, Dr. Abul Magd, who's who are trying to find common ground on drafting some corrections and amendments to that constitution. So the answer is yes. But it was not at the immediacy of the revolution of the Arab Spring. It was more recent, in the last 6 months or so.
We have time for one last question quickly. He's, as he used to say in another part of the world where there was great trouble, he has overfulfilled his norm already, and we will have an opportunity to return this evening and hear him talk about the universal changes. I think we should have one from this. Keep it brief because we don't have much more time. Thank you.
The question just is, after the recent upsetment in Mali and the destruction of the libraries in Timbuktu, is there a role for your institution to go out and gather up these regional ancient sources of knowledge and protect them? Would that be an appropriate role for the Bibliotheca Alexandria?
Well, it would, but of course, Jim Billington and the Library of Congress have already beaten everybody to this because they've been helping Mali with some of their manuscripts, and some of these manuscripts are now in digital form available on the World Digital Library. In fact, it was one of the first big projects that were done in that respect. And yes, it does show us something which is, my credo, my belief, and why I will fight against it. I fight not physically, but with ideas and with passion. Zealotry is the enemy of knowledge and rationality and humanism. And whether it was the Christian zealots who burnt the ancient library and killed Hypatia, or it is Buddhist zealots in other countries like Myanmar, or Hindu zealots in Amritraj, or Taliban zealots killing girls in Pakistan or in there, or destroying the Bamiyan Buddhas, or Muslim zealots as well as the Taliban being Muslim zealots as well, destroying things in Mali or elsewhere. zealotry is intolerant of pluralism. Zealotry is based on the perception, I have the truth, and everybody else is wrong, and anybody who contradicts me is therefore my enemy, and it is therefore all right to destroy them and to destroy what they did. And just as you know, I had a big debate at the time with some people, I was still at the World Bank, when in Afghanistan, they destroyed the Bamyan Buddhas, these two big Buddhas. And I said to somebody, you know, Muslims have been in Afghanistan for over 1,000 years. Nobody ever thought of destroying these Buddhas till now. So what's wrong with it? I mean, all these other guys were not Muslims? And his answer was, yeah, but they didn't have the technology to destroy it. Now we do. So, that shows you how far gone some of these people are. But there is, as I cited Napoleon Bonaparte, in the long run, ideas will always win out. Even if in the short term, by the sword, they can impose some destruction. The ideas will survive, and that's what makes us human.
Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.